February 2026, the United States and Israel attacked Iran, and the global oil market collapsed in a single day. And the only thing standing between Africa and an energy collapse was a refinery almost nobody wanted built. This is Nigeria, Africa's largest oil producer, 37 billion barrels under the ground. Every day, crude oil leaves this country and heads to refineries across the world. And every day for decades, the fuel came right back. Nigeria pumped oil out, shipped it thousands of miles, then bought it back at a higher price. $10 billion every year to import fuel from its own oil. And Nigeria wasn't alone. Across the continent, the same loop repeated. Africa produced the crude, but the rest of the world kept the profit. Now, this is what made the system dangerous. The US and Israel struck Iran. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point carrying 20% of the world's oil. Prices surged. Supply chains snapped. The International Energy Agency called it the largest disruption in oil market history. Every fuel line in Africa cut, no reserves, no backup, no plan except one, the Dangote Petroleum Refinery. $20 billion, 650,000 barrels a day, the largest single-train refinery on earth. It hit full capacity on February 11th, just 17 days before the strait closed, within which one facility was supplying 5 African countries and with dozens seeking supply agreements. In weeks, the entire flow of fuel across Africa flipped, but this refinery was never supposed to exist. But over a decade, Nigeria's own government, its regulators, a powerful import cartel, all tried to stop it. The man behind it, Aliko Dangote, risked everything and nearly lost it.
If we knew what we are really going to get into, we wouldn't have started at all.
Is that a fact? Definitely, you wouldn't have done it?
No, really, it is a fact. Because, personally, I tell you, if you give me that opportunity to do it again, I don't think if I'm going to do it.
So how did one man build the refinery a system tried to kill and finish it just in time to save the continent? This is the Strait of Hormuz. It is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and through it flows roughly 1/5 of all oil traded on the planet, 21 million barrels every single day. For decades, energy analysts have called this the most important choke point on Earth. The one bottleneck that, if it ever closed, will cause the kind of crisis the modern world has ever experienced. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched joint airstrikes on Iran. And within days, Iran did exactly what the world had feared for decades. It shut the Strait of Hormuz. The International Energy Agency, an organization not known for dramatic language, called what happened next the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Now, here is the part of this story that most people outside of Africa have not been paying attention to. When the strait closed, it did not hit everyone equally. Wealthy nations, the United States, Japan, South Korea, Europe, they have something called strategic petroleum reserves. Months of stored oil sitting in underground caverns and tank farms ready for exactly this scenario. The International Energy Agency actually requires its member to hold at least 90 days of net oil import reserves as a condition of membership. Not a single African country is a member of the International Energy Agency, not one. And it gets worse. The majority of African nations are not just oil importers, they are importers of refined fuel. They do not even buy crude oil and refine it themselves. They buy the finished product, the gasoline, the diesel, the jet fuel, shipped from refineries in the Persian Gulf in Europe, sometimes from as far as Asia. But when those roads went dark, Africa did not just face higher prices, it faced the prospect of running out of fuel entirely. Kenya imports 100% of its petroleum products, almost all of it from the Middle East. By late March, roughly 20% of Kenya's 3,000 fuel stations were already experiencing shortages. The port of Mombasa, Kenya's main fuel import terminal, has 0 petroleum tankers scheduled to dock for a 2-week stretch. Uganda's fuel stocks were projected to last just weeks. South Sudan began rationing electricity in its capital. Mauritius imposed restrictions on electricity consumptions across the island. A continent of 1.4 billion people, the fastest growing population on Earth, was staring at an energy catastrophe it had absolutely no part in creating. But there is something else happening in this story, something most people do not know about. Because while the rest of the world was watching oil prices and war footage, something extraordinary was unfolding on the outskirts of Lagos, Nigeria. To understand what is sitting on the coastline, you first need to know one of the most absurd economic arrangements on the planet. Nigeria is Africa's largest crude oil producer. The country sits on an estimated 37 billion barrels of proven reserves. For decades, it has been one of the top oil exporting nations in the world. And yet, for most of its modern history, Nigeria has imported nearly all of its refined fuel. It imported crude oil out of the ground, shipped it thousands of miles to refineries in Europe and America, and then bought back the finished product at enormous price. The country was spending over $10 billion a year just importing fuel it could have refined at home. Nigeria has 4 government-owned refineries: Kaduna, Port Harcourt, Warri. They have been effectively idle for years despite billions of dollars spent on what officials call turnaround maintenance. None of them produced meaningful output. The crude oil was there. The demand was there. The refining capacity was not. This is the Nigeria that Aliko Dangote looked at and said enough. Aliko Dangote is not a name most people outside of Africa know, but within the continent he is inescapable. Africa's richest person, a Nigerian industrialist who built the Dangote Group into one of the most diversified conglomerates on the continent. Cement plants across 17 African countries, sugar refineries, flour mills, a massive fertilizer operation. But in September 2013, Dangote announced something far bigger than anything he had built before. He was going to construct the largest single-train oil refinery in the world, right here on the outskirts of Lagos. The project was originally planned for Ondo State, closer to Nigeria's oil-producing region. But when the state government failed to provide the political support needed for a project of this scale, Dangote moved the entire operation to Lagos, to a stretch of swampland in Lekki Free Trade Zone along the Atlantic coast. The initial cost estimate was $9 billion. Dangote committed $3 billion from his own group. The rest will come from commercial loans. That $9 billion will eventually become 19. But here is the part that matters most, and the part that separates this from every other Megaproject press release in the history of African infrastructure. Dangote did not just talk about it, he built it. What Dangote and his team constructed in Lekki is not just a refinery, it is a self-contained industrial city. The site covers 6,180 acres, roughly 2,500 hectares of land that was, before construction began, swampland. All of it had to be reclaimed from the lagoon, dredged, built, compacted, and engineered to support some of the heaviest industrial equipment ever manufactured. Construction began in earnest in 2017. And from the start, this project broke records that had nothing to do with oil. The refinery's crude distillation column, the core piece of the equipment that separates crude oil into components product, is the largest ever built for a single train refinery. It stands 112 meters tall, it weighs 2,350 tons, and that is before you add the internal trays, which add another 536 tons. It was manufactured by Sinopec in China, a 14-month build, then loaded onto a specialized vessel and shipped to Lagos, a journey that took 4 months across open ocean. When it arrived at the refinery in December 2019, a Dutch heavy lifting specialist, Mammoet, used the world's largest capacity cranes to lift the column and place it on its foundation as a single piece. But the column was not the only record that day. The refinery also installed the world's heaviest regenerator, a 3,000-ton component of catalytic cracking system which breaks heavy crude into lighter products like gasoline. It was the heaviest single piece of steel structure ever manufactured, the heaviest item ever transported on public road in Africa, and the heaviest regenerator ever installed in any refinery anywhere on earth. And beneath the surface, Dangote was building something equally ambitious, the largest subsea pipeline infrastructure in the world. Twin 38-inch pipelines stretching roughly 1,100 kilometers from the Niger Delta to Lekki, with a combined capacity of 3 billion standard cubic feet of gas per day. This pipeline network feeds gas to the refinery's power plant and fertilizer complex and captures flared gas from offshore platforms that would otherwise be wasted. The refinery itself is a single integrated processing train, one massive crude distillation unit feeding into the chain of cracking, treating, and conversion units. Its Nelson Complexity Index, the industry standard for measuring how sophisticated a refinery is, sits as 10.5. That is more complex than the average American refinery, which scores 9.5, and considerably more advanced than European average of 6.5. The refinery has its own 435 megawatt power plant, enough to power a small country, and more than the total capacity distributed by some Nigerian electricity companies. It has 177 storage tanks with a combined capacity of 4,742 billion liters. This is not a refinery that was bolted onto an existing Nigerian infrastructure. This is a parallel industrial civilization built from scratch on reclaimed swamps by a private citizen in a country where the government's own refineries have not worked in years. The project was announced in 2013 with a target completion of 2016. It did not begin construction until 2016. COVID hit in 2020, disrupting supply chains during a critical phase. Costs escalated from $9 billion to $19 billion in July 2022. With the project still not finished, Dangote had to borrow 187 billion naira, roughly $442 million at interest rate above 12% just to get the refinery across the finish line. The refinery was officially commissioned on May 22, 2023. It received its first crude oil delivery, 1 million barrels of crude oil, in December of that year, and in January 2024, it began producing diesel and jet fuel. But here is where the story takes a turn that should make anyone watching this angry. Nigeria, Africa's largest crude oil producer, could not adequately supply its own refinery with oil. Dangote Refinery needs roughly 13 to 15 cargoes of crude oil per month to operate at full capacity. Each cargo is approximately 1 million barrels. According to the refinery's CEO, David Baird, it has been receiving about 5. That is roughly a third of what it needs. Between October 2025 and mid-March 2026, reporting by Punch found the refinery faced a crude supply shortfall of approximately 79.53 million barrels. It received only around 27% of what it needed. Meanwhile, during the same period, Nigeria continued exporting crude oil abroad. In June 2024, Dangote's VP of Oil and Gas publicly accused international oil companies operating in Nigeria of deliberately frustrating the refinery's effort to buy domestic crude, allegedly inflating prices above market rates to force the refinery to import from overseas. The result, by mid-2025, roughly 60% of the crude processed at Africa's largest refinery was being imported from the United States. American light sweet crude, shipped across the Atlantic to a refinery sitting on the doorstep of one of Africa's largest oil-producing regions. Nigeria's president, Bola Tinubu, intervened in October 2024 ordering NNPC, the national oil company, to sell crude to the refinery in naira instead of dollars, an agreement designed to save Nigeria's billions in foreign exchange. But implementation has been inconsistent. The volume have not matched the agreement, and the broader fight between a private refinery trying to serve its country and entrenched system that has profited for decades from Nigeria's import dependency continues. And yet, despite all of this, on February 11, 2026, the Dangote refinery hits its full design capacity of 650,000 barrels per day. The first single-train refinery of that scale anywhere in the world to reach full nameplate capacity. 17 days later, the Strait of Hormuz closed. What happened next is something that no one, not Dangote, not the Nigerian government, not a single energy analyst could have planned. As the Hormuz crisis choked off the fuel supplies from Middle East, African governments began scrambling for alternatives, and one by one, they turned to the only large-scale refinery on the continent that was actually working. Ghana, South Africa, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, Tanzania, Togo, these countries, some of which had depended on Gulf refineries for decades, were now reaching out to Lagos. The number tells the story. In February, Nigeria was exporting around 100,000 barrels per day of refined products. By March, that figure had more than doubled to approximately 214,000 barrels per day. Shipments specifically to other African countries nearly doubles as well. The refinery completed the sale of 12 cargoes totaling 456,000 tons of refined products to Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, Tanzania, Ghana, and Togo. These were the refinery's first large-scale petrol exports since reaching full capacity just weeks earlier. And critically, the fuel quality itself was an upgrade for this market. The Dangote refinery produces Euro V standard gasoline and diesel, a significant quality improvement for African markets that have historically relied on lower grade imports, and the shorter shipment distances from Lagos to West and Central African ports mean lower logistical costs compared to fuel shipped from Persian Gulf or Europe. South Africa, one of the continent's largest economies, has been seeking a 12-month standard supply contract with the refinery. Kenya, whose port of Mombasa went weeks without a fuel tanker, has also reached out. When Dangote spoke to the economists about the crisis, he did not talk about profit, he talked about survival. His words were, "Right now, it is not about pricing, it is about availability." And that single sentence captures the shift that is happening in real time. For decades, Africa exported crude oil and imported finished fuel. The Dangote refinery is beginning to reverse that cycle. Not fully, not yet, but structurally. The refinery now supplies roughly 92% of Nigeria's domestic petrol demand, and it's becoming, by default and by necessity, the downstream energy anchor for the region. But this story demands honesty, and the honest truth is that Dangote refinery, as extraordinary as it is, cannot save an entire continent by itself. About 75% of its output is still consumed domestically in Nigeria. The fraction available for export, while still growing, is limited. Most African countries still do not have meaningful strategic fuel reserves, and refinery itself continues to struggle with crude supply, receiving only a fraction of the domestic crude it needs and paying global market prices for imported feedstock. Even with the refinery at full capacity, Nigerian fuel prices have hit record high, rising roughly 35% since the start of the war. Because the refinery buys crude at international benchmark prices, the global price surge feeds directly into what Nigerians pay at the pump. The refinery is a lifeline, but it is one refinery in a continent of 54 countries and 1.4 billion people. The crisis has exposed how much more Africa needs, which is why what Dangote announced next matters so much. In October 2025, before the crisis even began, Dangote committed to doubling refinery's capacity, a second 750,000 barrel per day processing train to be built right next to the existing plant, bringing total capacity to 1.4 million barrels per day. If completed, the expanded facility will rival India's Jamnagar's complex, currently the largest single-site refinery in the world, and could become the largest refining operation at a single location anywhere on the planet. Contracts are already signed. In January 2026, Engineers India Limited was awarded a $350 million project management deal for the expansion, reprising the role it played on the original build. In February, a $400 million equipment agreement was signed with XCMG, one of China's largest construction machinery manufacturers, for the heavy equipment needed to fast-track the build. The target, 3 years, completion around 2028 or 2029. The expansion is not just about fuel. Polypropylene production, the raw material for plastic, is set to nearly triple. Urea fertilizer output is planned to reach 9 million tons per year with a path to 12 million. That would position Dangote as one of the largest fertilizer producers on the planet, directly relevant to a continent where food security depends on affordable agricultural input. And in perhaps the most symbolically powerful move of all, Dangote announced that the refinery will be listed on Nigerian Stock Exchange. Ordinary Nigerians, not just billionaires and institutions, will be able to own a piece of the refinery shares, purchased in Naira. Dividends payable in Naira or US dollars at the shareholders' choice. Analysts project the listing could push Nigeria's stock market capitalization to over $140 billion, nearly doubling it. It will be among the largest IPOs in African history. As of the recording of this video, the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed. Oil prices remain above $100 a barrel. Analysts warn that if the crisis extends into mid-April and beyond, the world could face what some are calling an oil cliff, a point at which strategic reserves run dry and no stopgap measure can prevent severe shortages. Africa will feel this harder than almost anyone else. It always does. The continent has absorbed shock after shock. COVID, the Ukraine war, now this. Each time bearing the cost of crisis it had no role in creating. But for the first time, there is something different in this story. For the first time, when the crisis hit, Africa had an answer that was built on its own soil, financed by its own capital, and producing fuel to its own standard. If you like definitive African infrastructure projects like this, please like and subscribe, and let me know in the comment section what you think Africans can do to reduce dependency. See you on the next one.